Hi everyone, good evening. In the first part of my series of articles on DevOps and building Dexterity applications with Visual Studio Team Services, I covered how to structure the actual project of the build engine and the steps that initially we went through to set up the build process. But just a quick recap, if I click here on code, you will see that our build engine has the different elements that are part of this actual project. Dexterity projects are not necessarily like Visual Studio projects where you can have a direct link and integration between your actual code repository and the build process. Although you can leverage some of those components, you probably want to maintain your Dexterity projects completely separated from the build projects in order to facilitate the navigational aspect of your code repository. So for this, we actually set up a build project, and that build project has some main key components here. As you can tell, we have actually included the different versions of Dexterity with the Dexterity components that are needed for that version. And all we did was copy up a straight or made a straight copy of the Dexterity installation folder and added that as part of our Visual Studio Team Services project. Less the help files, less the manuals, less the sample files, because we don't need those for any of this. And obviously, it keeps our build projects pretty tight. So I have actually created folders for Dex 12, Dex 14, Dex 16, and obviously these are actual copies of my local Dexterity application. I also have included a macros folder, and that macros folder contains the actual build macros that you would normally use to build a Dexterity project. So these would basically select the dictionaries, extract the code, transfer any alternate resources that you can think of, and finally do the chunking or the auto chunking process where you can assign your product information and obviously your dictionary information. So these are these macros. We also have macros that inject constants if needed. But what these would do is after downloading the code repository, it will use the standard menus in Dexterity to basically allow you to import these constants files. So as you can imagine, once constants are imported, these are actually, the dictionaries are recompiled before they are extracted. Okay, in the resources folder, we have actually set up blank dictionaries, and these blank dictionaries correspond to the current versions of Microsoft Dynamics GP that we support, and these are needed in order to extract the repository files into clean dictionaries prior to building those out and extracting them. Then we have our scripts folder, and our script folder contains a number of PowerShell scripts that we've created to help us automate a whole bunch of other aspects within the build process. And I'll show later on how these are used. So in part, we have the chunk dictionary, PowerShell script, which basically runs Dexterity utilities, I should say, and passes in the macro parameter in order to extract and chunk the dictionaries as needed. Then we have a PowerShell script that basically all it does is it returns or retrieves our repository code into the folder, into the build folder that we use to host those files. Once the files are downloaded, they're basically downloaded using the REST API from Visual Studio Team Services. We will take those files and import them into our dictionary. And we have a few helper functions that helps us build compile messages that we need. So it basically updates the build information for our project or our product and allows us to, in essence, set the parameters that we want that are needed for our Dexterity application. Then we have the dictionaries. Basically, what it does is it updates the code that pulls and installs the particular dictionaries in the different folders in our within the build agent. And then we have a number of module environment PowerShell things that we actually need to use for a dictionary. And we use as well the REST API responding to Visual Studio Team services in order to basically download that information and set that information up in our code. And we have a number of test scripts, and that basically updates all the major code that is driven by our helper function or our helper PowerShell script, and in essence that basically completes the product. So we can see some of these scripts here. You have the constants one basically, or the chunk dictionary script, which basically takes the Dexterity utilities and passes in the parameters needed, and basically completes the process of executing dictionary and the macro. So that's in summary some of the aspects of the chunking process. Now on to the build engine itself. I cover some of this in the second part of the series. The build engine, in essence, allows us to then take those different components from our initial implementation and then run all these through in an orchestrated way to basically generate the outputs that we need. And these build engines, you can see here we have a setting or a script, a PowerShell script that will then set up the folders. These folders basically are folders that are needed for hosting some of our files. We create a build folder, a source folder. So the build folder basically hosts our compressed dictionaries without source code. And we also need compressed dictionaries with source code included. That's for our QA team. We set up a folder where we'll keep logs for all the macros and all the execution parts of the build process. Then we have a generic folder which can be used to store a number of non-related files as part of the engine process. And then we have a temp folder where we can keep any aspects of the chunking process that we consider irrelevant, or where we need to store files momentarily until a particular step is completed. Now, in addition, the second step that we have is the ability to pull the actual code. This code is pulled down into a generic folder. Where is it pulled from? It's actually pulled from our repository. Hence, we run the get vsts.ps1 script that we created. So there's a number of articles online that you can check to see how to automate the REST API, the Visual Studio Team Services REST API, and being able to interact with these online. In short, you will need a token, and that token is almost like a 64-bit, 64-byte key that you can store with your PowerShell script to basically allow you to connect to your code repository. Then we can pass in some arguments to this script. As you can tell here, we're actually passing in the module, the build number, user ID, and the token itself that we are going to use. And then here in our, as part of the different arguments, we have our credentials, I can say, that allows me to, or allows our code that pulls from our repository to determine exactly what build will be pulled as well. All right, the next step in this is to set up the module environments, and the module environments and compile dictionaries will determine basically the build numbers that we're going to pass in, and I'll show you where we set up those environment variables right now. And it also allows us to set up a number of control options if we wanted to, whether we want to fail on standard error, enable errors, control options enabled or not. But more particularly, we run a PowerShell script for this as well, which allows us to set up the module environment variables. And that is pulled, if you can click here, we'll pull it from the different scripts that are within the environment. We saw that that's part of the actual project structure for this build engine is part of the code that is stored with this build project, this build engine project. Then we run the extract process, and you can see now the extract step is just also a PowerShell script that will then run our utilities and specify what version number we are going to actually pass into the Dexterity utilities in order to attach that to the actual chunking process. So when you go to the auto chunk, you will have the ability to define your product information, and that product information will contain obviously the build number of your product, and version number of your product. So we pass that in as part of the process itself. Then we have the build artifacts, and an artifact is nothing more than the result of the extraction and the chunking process. So you will have your actual extracted dictionary plus your chunk files. Those constitute artifacts that need to be somehow stored somewhere. And as you can see here, what we're doing is we actually taking anything that's in the build folder. We actually taking those chunk files and we're moving it to the artifacts build folder. So artifacts is a native construct from the build process, and it's a native target folder within the environment. All we got to do is attach a /build, and the platform will automatically create those subfolders for us as needed. Now we can copy the source code artifacts as well. So here we're actually moving the actual source code chunk files plus the dictionary, and we move that to our source folder. And then finally, once we have those artifact subfolders and folders ready, we publish those into the artifacts directory. So and we set up an artifact name for that. So that would create a subfolder from within the project itself, and we will actually have that reside on the Visual Studio Team Services server, as opposed to downloading them locally. So what the build agent will do is it will actually push this information out into the build artifacts directory on that server, and that basically summarizes the entire process. Now you would ask, how do we actually get to set up those variables? So here in the variables directory, we have a number of parameters that we have actually predefined for or defined for our project. So one is the build number. Our current build number is 160. We can target specific modules, and that basically allows, since we have 5 products, it will allow us to build a specific product if we want to, or build all components, all 5 products at once. We can determine what version of Microsoft Dynamics GP we're targeting. So in this case, either 2013, 2015, 2016, and even 2018. And then we can actually set up the user ID and the token, the personal access token that will allow us to communicate to our source code repository. When the build process is executed, then all these parameters are passed into the different PowerShell scripts and different consumers that are going to use these variables within the environment. So you have additional options that you can set up or configure for your build. In this case, you can set up the things like timeout in minutes. So if you suspect you have a process that should take up a certain amount of time and it doesn't complete within that time, you can determine whether you can time it out. And then the build job can also be set up to be timed out in an amount of time. So in that sense, this rounds out the third installment of my series. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please, if you have any questions, direct those on @DGP Blogster on Twitter, or actually fill out your comments in the comments section of this video blog. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.